So, as I mentioned in the last portion of the lesson, we will be diving in a little bit deeper into natural selection. Darwin's ideas of natural selection boil down to two things: sex and death. Those individuals who have features that allow them to survive, thus avoiding death, will pass on these features to the next generation through reproduction or sex. By having more offspring, these organisms are said to have a higher fitness. So that's a review of what I just said earlier about the importance of reproduction in evolution. Basically, if you don't pass on your genes to the next generation, you are insignificant as far as evolution is concerned. So I mentioned earlier that natural selection can do different things. There are different patterns of natural selection: directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, or no selection. All right, so we're going over time, and in the first column we're seeing a directional selection. So we're seeing that arrow pull us to the left a little bit, which is making body size go down over time. Stabilizing selection is taking away the extremes in a population. So you can see in stabilizing selection in that column when the extremes are going down and the middle is going up, which means body size is favored, the average body size is favored in the second row here. So over time, body size is not changing. Here on column 3, we're seeing disruptive selection. So for some reason or another, maybe because there's a competitor in the area, this median body size or average body size is not as fit. So being the average body size is a disadvantage for some reason, but the smallest and the largest are successful in this environment. So here we're seeing a split in disruptive selection where the largest and the smallest are selected for, and over time there becomes two populations, the largest and the smallest. So that is pretty cool and interesting to imagine happening. And then finally at the end we see no selection. This might be, well, let's move on to the next couple slides, and I'll probably explain more about each of these. Okay, so as I said, there are quite a few patterns of natural selection as illustrated in the previous slide, and the slides, the following slides show the same graph again. I will discuss all of these columns: directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, and stasis or no selection at all. So imagine that we're looking at something simple like body size over time in a group of organisms. In column A, the individuals who happen to be small have a higher survival rate and reproduce more often. That's directional selection. In other words, small individuals have a higher fitness. The distribution of size shifts to the left, and thus the average size of a population drops. Stabilizing selection works against both the very small and very large. Fitness would be highest in the average size individuals. Because of this, the average body size in the population would not change, even though natural selection is still at work, eliminating the extremes in the population. And I mentioned this earlier. How natural selection, even if there's no change in the body size, natural selection is still working to basically pick off the largest and the smallest in the population. Disruptive selection is essentially the opposite of this. The average individuals have the lowest fitness, and the smallest and largest individuals are the ones that have the highest fitness. Over time, the average body size over the population may not change at all, so the average doesn't change, but there are two clusters, the smallest and largest, eventually perhaps leading to two distinct populations and maybe even two distinct species. Finally, there are situations where a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and no selection occurs. Fitness will vary according to other variables, but not size, and the average size will not change over time. So for whatever reason, there are no environmental factors resulting in selection for this one trait, body size. There will be selection on other traits, but body size is remaining the same. So let's look at a famous example of natural selection. The peppered moth is probably one of the most famous examples of natural selection. So in this example, we've got several elements. Variation, as you can see the two moths here, there is variation in the population, and something in the environment changes to result in a natural selection. So pay attention and think about what that could be. So, in Great Britain, there's a kind of moth called the peppered moth. As the name implied, it is white with spots, and it blends in beautifully with the lichen and bark on trees, thus avoiding constant predation from birds and other animals that eat moths. So, the natural environment for this moth is a light-colored bark with lichen. I don't know if you've seen what lichen looks like, but I will show you on the next slide. So, the light-colored moth blends in with its natural habitat. In 1848, a naturalist discovered a new variety of peppered moth that was completely black. This was described as being the melanic form compared to the non-melanic light form of the moth. Though originally rare, by 1950, over 90% of the moths were the melanic or darker variety. Well, this happened because of evolution. During the 1880s, Britain experienced the Industrial Revolution and literally covered the landscape, including the trees, with soot from coal-burning plants. So here is the lichen on this picture here, and you probably know what lichen looks like, even if you can't, if you don't think of it as a lichen. You've probably seen something like this before. So against the backdrop of lichen and tree bark, previously the lighter moth blended in, and you can see how the lighter colored moth would be camouflaged on this lichen. However, against a soot-covered backdrop, dark soot from burning coal or burning other types of fuel, the light-colored moth was suddenly easily noticed and would stand out and was eaten by predators. The frequency of the non-melanic form dropped. But against the dark backdrop, the dark-colored moth was camouflaged and survived long enough to reproduce and pass on the melanic genes. This variety increased in frequency, the frequency of the melanic moth, particularly in the most industrialized areas of Great Britain, such as Manchester and Birmingham. So here we go, before industrialization and after industrialization. So this is an important point to make. I'll probably make this point again later in the lesson, but evolution and adaptations are only good for the current environment, the environment in which those adaptations formed, in most cases. So you might think that previously the peppered moth in its light form was highly evolved and had a perfect adaptation. But if the environment changes, an adaptation that was great can become maladaptive, and the adaptation that was, or the mutation that was a disadvantage can become an advantage. So in the genetics, we can look at it, the moth colorization, as a single gene with two alleles, and we can see in the graph that the gene frequencies changed over the course of 100 years. And the peppered moth experienced quite dramatic directional selection. And we can see that again. But let's look at this in terms of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is basically an equation that we can use to test to see if evolution has occurred. All right, so according to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if a mutation does not occur, a natural selection does not occur, and populations are large, and individuals randomly mate with one another, then the gene frequencies should remain exactly the same generation to generation. So this graph is basically showing changes in gene frequencies. It's showing the frequencies and calculating them, and you don't need to know all of this for this class. But it gives you an example of how geneticists would do their work in detecting evolution. So it could have been during industrialization that there was equilibrium for a while, that nothing was changing, but things have changed. Beginning in the 1960s, Great Britain enacted anti-pollution laws, and the trees were no longer covered in soot. It was no longer advantageous to be melanic, and as one might predict, the peppered variety is increasing in frequency. So this graph shows the melanic at 10% and the non-melanic at 90%. So the evolution kind of happened again, and the light-colored peppered moth bounced back. So evolution has occurred again. All right, this brings us to the end of part 3 of the forces of evolution lesson. We are going to move on to part 4, so please proceed to part 4.